Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Negotiation. In this episode, we speak with Gordon Houlden, Director and Professor of Political Science at the China Institute, as well as an adjunct professor of business at the Alberta School of Business at the University of Alberta. We begin our conversation with a brief history of China's maritime geography and how their navy has grown to surpass the United States in quantity of hulls in the water. We talk about the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and the limitations of the international agreement, particularly when it comes to historical claims. We compare China's actions in the South China Sea to their stated intentions publicly and explore the reasons why China cares about other maritime regions such as Antarctica and the Arctic, despite not having any borders nearby. We also discuss the feasibility of all the South China Sea nations being able to come together on an agreement and the necessary steps that would need to be taken for that to come to fruition. Enjoy.
And one major problem for them is the United States, which, while it has no South China Sea claims per se, no territorial claims, is not about to give up its right of exercising its ships, submarines, and aircraft in the regions in ways which it believes, I think largely is true, are in compliance with the law of the sea, but which run straight against Chinese own maritime doctrines, which are only partially aligned with the law of the sea. So it's hard for me to imagine right now a general Pax Pacifica, which would in effect codify what Chinese have built and taken and codify it as an international regime.
Home to over 4 billion people, the Asia-Pacific region boasts one of the most powerful consumer markets on the planet. Not only is it home to half the world's under 30 population, but it's also home to more than half the world's internet users. It's a market no globally minded brand should ignore, but entering markets like China is no easy task. Just ask the likes of Microsoft, Google, Uber, and Facebook. Times are changing, and with the right partners, doors are slowly opening as more and more companies find success expanding into the markets of the Middle Kingdom. I myself spent 8 years in China, mostly as a venture capitalist, helping early-stage tech companies enter the Asia-Pacific market successfully. This show is dedicated to uncovering and examining successful China entry and growth strategies by interviewing the people behind those success stories. My name is Todd Embley, and welcome to The Negotiation, brought to you by WPIC Marketing and Technologies. Gordon, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for coming on today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
As usual, we would love to have a quick introduction of yourself and really your relationship and background as it relates to China.
Well, fair enough. I'm from Alberta originally. I joined the Foreign Service after working as an archaeologist in South America. I was posted in Cuba and became fascinated by the way that socialist economies worked or didn't work in the case of Cuba. I like languages, and I'd learned Spanish as a child and French, and the government kindly sent me to the Chinese University in Hong Kong to learn Chinese for a couple of years, then posted to Beijing. And by that point, I was basically captured in the orbit of China, not in the political sense, but in the interest sense. And in my 32 years in the Foreign Service, I spent 22 working on China, had 5 postings, working at headquarters. And my last job before I left government was as Director General for East Asia, running our China, Japan, Korea, etc. programs. I left in 2008 to go to the China Institute as the first full-time director, and until I left as director, becoming Director Emeritus at the end of 2020, I built the China Institute into a think tank focused on policy issues, economic, political, trade, investment, and we built the best tracker of Chinese investment in Canada, given that was a particularly controversial issue during the period around 2010 to 2020.
I'm wondering if you might be able to indulge me for a second. And, and this can be at a super high level, but what is the maritime geography around China? If you could potentially just set the scene for us and talk about why is China so focused on that maritime geography surrounding China?
What you raise is a fascinating subject because for most of Chinese imperial history, so let's say roughly for the last couple thousand years, until the 19th century, slightly before that time frame, but around the 19th century, the political beast that was China, imperial China, with the various dynasties, the threats to China were perceived as almost entirely coming from the north and the west, what the Chinese considered barbarians, but who had their particular cavalry skills and martial skills. The Mongols invented the stirrup, which gave them the capacity to fire projectiles with accuracy while galloping, those sorts of things. When China was united and strong, those Western and Northern peoples posed little risk. When China was divided and weak between dynasties, for example, when dynasties were at a low ebb, they were often dominated, even conquered by outsiders. That was the case of the Mongols, the case of the Manchu, for example, and there were others. So that was the focus. What China was asleep about largely was its maritime border. Now, there were issues. The Japanese raided the coast. There was one particular dynasty that stands out, the Ming, which had developed a extraordinary maritime capacity, sent expeditions as far as Africa, bringing back giraffes on deck and a series of voyages to that region. But at the end of the day, when the Qing came back in, again, a land-based, cavalry-based regime, they basically burned the records, burned the ships, and turned their back on, even moved the population away from the coast. This left China particularly ill-prepared for the arrival of militarily advanced, that is, the military technology of Europeans, the Portuguese, the Dutch, but in particular the British, the French, who then, at a time of relative weakness in China, particularly though military weakness, began to encroach on China. China lost a series of wars in the 19th century. Pieces of China were carved off, such as Hong Kong, or trade concessions were conceded. And this was culminated, I would say, in the rise of Japan in the late 19th century, a losing war against the Japanese. China lost Korea, lost Taiwan, and then ultimately paid a heavy price with a aggressive Japan invading China, conquering most of China, until, of course, the Japanese were ultimately defeated largely by the Americans in 1945. So there was a rude awakening for China, but China has learned that lesson. And now in this 21st century, they are pursuing a strongly maritime-based, region-based, still a regional power above all else, although with global ambitions, that pays very close attention to its maritime littoral, particularly the first island chain, much of it controlled either by Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, etc. Looking beyond that, though, in terms of maritime capacity, with a navy that now exceeds that size of the United States Navy in terms of hulls in the water, not quite yet on qualitative terms, but very much a maritime China.
What is the UNCLOS? And if you actually could break that down for me, I'd appreciate it. I want to know what it is, but I also want to know, why does it matter? And what does it outline, and how does China treat this agreement?
It's interesting. The UNLOS, the Law of the Sea, is a document developed, took decades actually, but coming to fruition in the 1990s, that most of the international community has subscribed to, China included. The important exception, the United States, although the United States, interestingly, follows, including the United States Navy, the principles of the Law of the Sea. They could just never get it passed by any administration through Senate, and that's not going to change. So ironically, the world's leading naval power is not a signatory to the Law of the Sea. Canada is, China is, but most of the world's leading nations are almost entirely, even landlocked countries, often subscribe to the Law of the Sea. The important parts of it were codified, for example, economic zones, coastal zones, often usually determined by geography. What it doesn't do, it doesn't put a lot of emphasis on historical claims. In fact, those don't have standing according to the Law of the Sea. This was a complication for China as they began to increase their capacity as a nation and began to reach out beyond the brown water navy they had before and beyond the coast. In China, even in the People's Republic of China, had a policy of autarky, of limitation to its own resources, very little connections to the outside world in relative terms. But the law of the sea is particularly important in that it sets out and governs what is an island, what is a reef, where claims are possible, what is the difference between a economic zone and a actual territorial sea and an international waterway. Here, though, comes to the problem. I've had Chinese policymakers, and I'm an adjunct professor at the National Institute of South China Sea Policies, which is South China Sea Studies in Haikou and Hainan Island, which is 100% focused on issues of China's maritime and its littoral and its rights and obligations. The law of the sea does not give any standing to historical claims. So, and there are many overlapping claims in the South China Sea. So when China points out, well, fishermen have been coming there for 1,000 years, Chinese fishermen, et cetera, we've got a map or some documentation that proves this, that doesn't matter for the law of the sea. And quite frankly, if you take an underground reef, underwater reef, and you then build a structure upon it, and you then build an airfield and a complete island, by the law of the sea, that has no standing. But of course, it has practical standing. So within the Chinese maritime establishment, they now complain regularly to me that, well, in the 1990s, when we joined the law of the sea as signatories, we would have made many exceptions and we had not adapted every dimension of it. Our experts didn't really understand the implications of what they're signing at the time, so that there is a tension now. So that when you have, for example, the Philippines takes an arbitration case to the International Court of Justice, China refused to participate because they knew that strict interpretation of the law of the sea does not necessarily end up in a result that's in their favor. On the other hand, they've not walked away or not about to walk away from it. But you have a powerful maritime nation now that accepts some but not all the provisions and that has different interpretations. In some areas, there are gray areas. For example, in the law of the sea, doesn't really detail, is absolutely silent on what navies, that is naval vessels, can do within an economic zone, like Canada has, going out some 200 nautical miles. Or you have, in the case of China. So the U.S. Navy conducts military passages through China's economic zone. China protests and sees this as unacceptable. But there's absolutely nothing in the law of the sea that prohibits such actions. So you have a tension now within the UNLOS, within the law of the sea, and between China and its neighbors. To what extent does the law of the sea apply? China accepts the law of the sea, they're signatories, but they contest some of the principles.
What do you think, and I apologize if I'm asking you to look into a crystal ball that you may not have, but what do you think are the PRC's long-term objectives in the South China Sea?
I think China's long-term objectives in the South China Sea are to solidify their standing as the preeminent naval force within the region, displacing the United States Navy and pushing them further back eastward into the Pacific. Of course, the U.S. is not about to turn its back on its status as a Pacific power. It's been there for over 100 years, well over 100 years. One can argue closer to 150 years or beyond. But by their reclamation, their building onto existing islands which they controlled, islands in some cases they took in the paracels from Vietnam, islands which they have, which were unoccupied, which they've occupied, expanded, reefs that they've created. In effect, now a very impressive array of military force in the region, but also wanting to play, in effect, push out China's zone of military capacity far from the Chinese coast, deeper into the limits of the Chinese Sea. So the Chinese island claims now come within less than 100 kilometers from some parts of the Philippines, close to the Vietnam coast, much closer to Malaysia and Indonesia than either of those countries would be comfortable with. But I think their ambitions go beyond that now. But for the South China Sea, they want this to be a zone of Chinese control, perhaps in the way that the American Navy dominates the Caribbean. There's nothing in that region particularly since the collapse of the Soviet Union and its bases in Cuba. Nothing in the Caribbean that even begins to threaten the U.S. Navy. That's their vision, I believe, of a bit of a Monroe Doctrine, I suppose, for the South China Sea.
You mentioned some of the other, let's say, countries, like Vietnam or Malaysia, Philippines, that are, how do we say, supporting cast members in this drama. Who are the other players in the region, if I might ask you to maybe kind of lay out the fringe characters that are involved in this, and where do they agree and disagree with China and why?
It's very complicated, and it goes well beyond the naval or maritime dimensions. U.S. Navy we talked about as well. You have to talk about them first, because while the mainland is distant, Americans through bases in Japan, Guam, a developing relationship with Australia, a long-standing relationship with the Philippines, which is largely degraded but is not gone, and with the capacity to project force into the West Pacific. That is the principal antagonist for the PLA Navy. However, you can't call Japan a bit player. Japan has the probably ship per ship the most capable Navy on Earth. I've visited when I was at our defense college, Canadian National Defense College, a Japanese submarine, and the American submariner who was with me was so impressed by the ship, the seamanship of it. He said, "Look, you can't keeping a submarine clean is exceptionally difficult. And a couple hundred people." Or maybe sometimes smaller crew, but he said you could eat off the floor, off the deck of that Japanese submarine. It was that tidy, and they are highly capable. Non-nuclear, of course, but they now have ships which are helicopter carriers, which are approaching the size of aircraft carriers. They're a really critical component in the American strategy to oppose China's maximalist demands. Of Taiwan, which has a very small and well-funded but not particularly impressive navy. You have the North Koreans are perhaps China's only ally, which have actually an amazing military capacity. I don't think they have much of a blue water navy capacity, but they have a coastal capacity. The Republic of Korea, limited force projection capacity, but highly professional, highly skilled, well-educated Navy with good equipment. The Philippines, which has a still relatively strong defense relationship with the United States, but like others in the region, and this includes all of those, the ROK, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, these are all the principal trading partners of the United States. So they have to calculate in their naval strategies and their maritime strategies this economic dependence on China. China uses that to its own advantage. But the Philippine Navy is weak, poorly maintained, small, limited capacity, very much a coastal patrol operation at best. You have Vietnam, which is a land-based power, a tough military, as Americans discovered. And in fact, even China discovered in 1979 when they had a time-limited excursion into Vietnam. They have some Russian equipment they've bought, some of their own domestic, but again, a brown water navy. They were kicked out of the Paracels in 1975, I believe. They get into occasional skirmishes with China, but China has an overwhelming force capacity. If China got into a serious war with Vietnam, they could push Vietnam, in my opinion, off every single atoll and island where they are now lodged. China has itself bigger fish to fry. They want they want to dominate that region, not just in maritime terms, but in economic terms. They have lots of reasons to hold back their maximalist strength. And hence you see them standing their ground, but not taking moves, in my opinion, to push Vietnam off of where it stands, except they contest the claims. The Indian Navy wanders into the region occasionally, but they have their hands full in the Indian Ocean, in my view. They exercise with the Vietnamese and with Americans now, and Australians, but they're not yet a significant force in the region. They don't have a base. They are keeping the Chinese Navy under watch, and the Pakistani Navy in the Indian Ocean, I think, is about the limits of their capacity. Now, who knows for the future? But so that way, I'd argue, constitute the cast of characters in that ocean region.
You touched on a few of the strategic objectives of the PRC in its maritime fringe. Could you talk a little bit more about what those are? And I'm interested to know, have they been open about it? Have they been publicly able to express exactly what their objectives are? And do their actions reflect their words?
Chinese culture, and I think many of your listeners understand this is a culture where there's built in a very strong emphasis in public pronouncements on the positive. You don't get too much, the mask slips sometimes, but you don't get too much of the sort of realpolitik assessments you get from American think tanks or even American security officials. It tends to hew to a very much their own values, but an internationalist positive spin. Calculating what are their actual maritime intentions, you have to look not just at what they say, at what they do. And of course, as with most countries and particularly most great powers, there's always going to be a gap between the ideology and the actual practice. And that's true of the United States, in my opinion. I'm not saying they aren't about building and supporting democracies, but they also have taken a very realpolitik view of the earth historically, and China is no different. What's interesting for me in the Chinese case, though, is that China, again, has moved from autarky, from an economically self-reliant phase with basically a closed economy and a closed nation that ended decisively in 1978 when Deng Xiaoping and reformers opened the door and opened China to global prospects. China is now the leading trading partner of most countries on earth, about 2/3, I believe. And they are the world's largest trading power. And they are, interestingly, the dominant commercial factor in international commerce. Not that the goods are always sailing under Chinese flags, but they dominate more than half of the iron age trade that moves by sea. It goes to China. Same for most of the base metals. The trade is dominated by China. So they have these two imperatives. One, wanting to protect their coast, to project force out from their coast, to dominate their region strategically, which all great powers tend to want to do in their neighborhood. But they also have this extraordinary trading relationship. It's interesting to me. It's interesting to me that in the case of the Royal Navy in the UK, the British Empire, where commerce led ahead of the political expansion in many cases of the empire, the United Kingdom moved from a defense focused on those small islands that comprise the UK to a broader emphasis on freedom of navigation, patrolled by the Royal Navy, and support of trade, both their own mercantilist trade, but also more generally free trade. The United States went through the same development. If you look back into the 19th century, you find America building a host of forts, some along the Canadian border, but others on the coastline, defending their coast potentially from a renewed war with the United Kingdom, Britain. Gradually, however, though, deeper into the 19th century, America expanded its capacity, both in trade and naval terms, to the point that the U.S. Navy then began in the 20th century to replace the Royal Navy, or to work alongside them, but then eventually replacing them as the global patrol force in support of international commerce and free trade. I've been watching to see and waiting to see whether we'll see the same evolution of Chinese maritime thinking. Once they feel more comfortable in dominating the South China Sea and their immediate littoral, will they begin to shift to an approach whereby the movement of their own navy abroad, freedom of navigation for naval ships, will begin to overcome that maritime border protection sense, where they'll want to sail their ships freely around the world. It will be, because of their own strength, less concerned about a handful of naval vessels approaching their own shores. We will see. I haven't seen it yet, certainly in their ideology, and you see it only in a very limited practice. It's true that they do exercise with the Russian Navy, even in the Baltic and the Mediterranean and elsewhere. They sail ships, naval ships now, particularly into patrolling the approaches, the Malacca Straits, Persian Gulf. Sometimes it's anti-piracy. It's very often, I think, eventually a way to protect their own supply lines in case of a conflict. But we may yet see, and this would be projecting deep into the 21st century, a more global approach, whereas it will not just be a coastal protection thing, a immediate zone of influence, but in a global Chinese naval role in the way that you see, supported by bases, in the way you see the U.S. Navy playing that role and the way that Britain did before.
So it seems like the PRC has also expressed interest in maritime fringe of places like the Arctic, where its borders don't necessarily, at first glance, seem to extend. Why does it care about what's happening in other regions like the Arctic around the world?
Arctic and the Antarctic, areas where have been not just peripheral, but beyond, smaller than peripheral to Chinese history and Chinese thinking. I argue as the People's Republic of China acquires global ambitions, they are beginning to acquire and wish to acquire global reach. There's not one zone of the world where they don't have an interest. If you go to Antarctica, they have their own Arctic claims, of course. They have their own Antarctic bases. In the case of Arctic, they have, of course, not territorial claims, but they are very much focused on the governance of the Arctic. They are observers at the Arctic Council. There's a debate amongst the Arctic Council members whether to admit China. I think they did the right thing, because the Chinese are beginning to say, if you don't let us inside the tent in terms of the Arctic Council, we'll create our own institutions outside and disregard that. You didn't get it formally, but I used to pick that up informally in Chinese maritime circles. Of course, the number one is probably not defense, it's commerce. If you have, as we're seeing, a continued melting of the Arctic ice, you'll see along the northern route, which runs across the north of Siberia and Russia. You have sailing in that direction towards Europe. You can cut the sailing time to a third, perhaps, in terms of sailing. It's still relatively difficult. Ice-free, as defined by sailors, doesn't mean there's no ice. It means like maximum a third of ice, and you need hardened ships, etc. But that's already becoming a minor aspect of Chinese trading systems. The Northwest Passage is a much more difficult one. It's going to be icebound for a much longer period. Of course, it's complicated. China claims the Northwest Passage as a part of a territorial sea without a lot of support in the law of the sea. But we've already seen Chinese scientific expeditions pass through there through the Northwest Passage, albeit with Canadian agreement, which was important. And you've seen China beginning to make investments in the Canadian Arctic. Not as many as they'd like and not as large as they would like. But some of the projects which they are interested in are hard to be duplicated by any other country. In the case of Baffin Island, they're prepared, for example, to build the mine, build the railway, perhaps a couple hundred kilometers to the coast, build the port, and take the product. There's no other country on earth that's prepared to do that and has the financial capacity to do so. So for Canadians, for example, who are mostly Southerners, almost entirely Southerners, they view the Arctic as a pristine place, which it is generally, and one which should be preserved in a pristine state. If you live in the Arctic, and I see this dichotomy emerging at times, for those who live in the Arctic, be it in Nunavut, the Northwest Territories and the Yukon, there's a somewhat more pragmatic view of, look, we need development, we need jobs, we need investment. So there's a little bit of a tension there between the views of the South and the North when it comes to Chinese investment. But certainly they want to play a role there. Again, as a dominant takers of base metals, they want base metal production, and Canada is rich in many of those. And eventually there will be a naval force they're building. They're building icebreakers. They, in my view, have got more capable icebreakers than does Canada. They will have ice-capable naval ships. I think they've been careful not to be radical in their naval strategy in the Arctic, because they know that it'll be, I believe they understand it's a thinking foreign policy. They will be more alarming than reassuring, for sure, for the West. And so in the meantime, they have focused on the practical dimensions. They have been willing to sign the non-fishing pact. They're signatories, which forbids fishing in certain sensitive areas of the Arctic, which is a very good thing because they have the capacity to devastate maritime resources if they deploy a huge number of fishing trawlers into the Arctic. So I think you've seen a cautious approach, but it is an ambitious approach, which will grow in profile over time if we can assume, and I think we can, China's ongoing status as a growing superpower.
If we are at something of a stalemate with respect to the South China Sea, what do you think it's going to take for the different stakeholders and everyone to come together to cooperate and hopefully come to some sort of agreement?
Well, I think that China now has most of what it wants. So I think that's one. This isn't necessarily the agreement that most would welcome, with exception of a couple islands in the Scarborough Reef near the Philippines. China has most of what it really needs. They're in a dominant position. They've ignored international opinion, particularly U.S. opinion, taken atolls, reefs, and small islets and expanded them into major military bases, vastly larger than was there before. So China has the strength of occupation, and they're not going to be pushed off those areas. On the one side, that means that China may be willing to say, okay, we'll just digest what we've got. And they'd like to codify it through particularly something called the Code of Conduct, which won't go into too much detail, but would involve the countries of ASEAN, of Southeast Asia, all of the claimants to areas within the South China Sea to reach an agreed set of rules. China doesn't want, in my opinion, any kind of a maritime war. They want to swallow what they've got, not bite much more than they have already. But that's very hard to do. And one major problem for them is the United States, which, while it has no South China Sea claims per se, no territorial claims, is not about to give up its right of exercising its ships, submarines, and aircraft in the regions in ways in which it believes, I think largely is true, are in compliance with the law of the sea, but which run straight against Chinese own maritime doctrines, which are only partially aligned with the law of the sea. So it's hard for me to imagine right now a general Pax Pacifica, which would in effect codify what Chinese have built and taken, and codify it as a international regime. The countries of Southeast Asia, some of them in particular, would prepare to cut at such a deal, even some of those with claims, minor claims. But it's hard for me to see how Vietnam, for example, which has lost some of its islands, pushed off militarily, or simply China's occupied and built up significant force that they're not going to be able to push the Chinese out, how that regime can be come to a global agreement. In the case of Japan, which doesn't have South China Sea claims, but does have territorial maritime claims in the East China Sea, how those can be reconciled with the claims of the China. There's been some rough agreements which have been semi-observed by the Chinese about not developing hydrocarbon reserves in the areas which are still under dispute. I don't think that's a hot dispute in the maritime sense with Japan, but I can't see a general settlement which would take massive concessions or considerable concessions by both sides, or a massive concession by one side or the other. So I think we're more likely to limp along in an area where at best they'll agree to disagree while still being each other's best trading partner. So it doesn't mean they're in the brink of war. China's number one trading partner by far. In the case of Korea, even more so, is China. 80% of Taiwan's exports go to China. So it's a really odd dichotomy. We have this chest thumping about the maritime reserve, and yet you have on the other side, behind the back, a thriving trade relationship in both directions. It's a puzzle. I just don't see a quick and easy way, and I've sat through innumerable maritime conferences and meetings every single year, including a few just in October, where the parties will argue about their various claims. I just don't see a general settlement in the offing.
Thank you, Gordon, so very much for coming on the show. Do you think you might have one or two other experts in their fields with regards to China that you might recommend as great guests we'd all like to listen to on this show? Sure.
Well, let me think about that, and I shall get back to you, but absolutely.
I appreciate that.
There are people I greatly respect who have a a lot of time. And can you do odd hours?
Yes. Yes.
Okay,
I do a lot of evenings with people in China for sure.
Yeah, you understand that. I knew that's going to be the case for you, who's in touch with all of these things. And
just furthering the exploration, understanding, not necessarily people in your field or, with your same level of or areas of expertise, right? Just other people and other things that all add to what we're doing here on the show. So,
well, here's the thing I find about China. The era of the China generalist, I mean, there are still, in my view, a value to knowing the language, to knowing the history, the culture, etc. But the hot spot now, for the last, I'd argue, 15 years at least, has been people who have a knowledge of China, but have a particular area of deep knowledge of China. It could be automotive engineering, but they know the Chinese automotive sector. You know this from your startup history, or people who have environmental chops, but they know a lot about the Chinese environmental movement. So there are some people in those categories. I know one very strong expert of the Chinese economy, of course you are as well, but who has a particular good understanding of the Chinese financial system, worked for the Bank of Canada, but posted in the embassy in Beijing. Who's someone who could talk Chinese economy in almost any dimension in some sophistication. I'll think of a couple of those names. Some of the fields may not appeal to you, such as environment, but there are people who understand that quite thoroughly, and some of them may be people of interest to you.
Gordon, thank you very, very much for coming on the show here again today. I know that I really appreciated this conversation. I know our listeners will as well, and we will have to make arrangements to have you back on the show at some time in the future.
Reach out anytime. Thanks so much. Take care.
Growing a company is hard. Doing it in a foreign market? Exponentially so. The best piece of advice I can give you is not to do it alone. When you start looking across the pond for further expansion possibilities, and I sincerely hope that you do, make sure you choose the right partners to do it with. My good friends at WPIC Marketing and Technologies have almost 20 years of experience helping brands just like yours enter China. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Negotiation, and if you're interested in being a guest or want to connect with me or any of our team, please reach out to us at podcast@wpic.co. And be sure to rate, comment, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. 再见.